Ambition. Ambition. Like almost everything else in human lives, it's complicated. On the one hand, it's often wonderful to see a man or a woman whose goals are clear and who has the commitment and the energy and the resourcefulness to reach those goals. And it's disappointing to see someone who's aiming at nothing, who doesn't care where their life is going, who has no direction or dreams or hopes, no ambition. Such a person too often avoids taking responsibility for the direction of their lives. As the years pass, such a life very often simply takes the course of greatest ease and comfort. On the other hand, ambition can be very ugly. An expression of self-centred, self-serving egotism. The man or the woman driven by ambition can do a great deal of damage for the sake of their ambition. Ambition can make a person a liar, a cheat, a bully. In my opinion, it is often the case that some who have seen the ugliness of ambition make it their ambition to have no ambition. Furthermore, ambition can be the cause of a great deal of conflict. Just look at federal politicians in recent times, particularly. The ambition of one person is often a threat to the ambition of another, and so it's very common for ambition in others to be resented. So, are you ambitious? Is your ambition a good thing? Or is it ugly? Or do you have a disappointing lack of ambition? Or is no ambition a virtue to which you aspire? And how do you regard the ambitions of others around you? The Christian life is an ambitious life. But like everything else in human lives, Jesus Christ redeems ambition. The general principle was spelled out by Jesus in terms of what human beings seek. The pagans seek food and drink and clothing, genuine human needs, and your heavenly Father knows that. But you, said Jesus, are to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, knowing that all these things will be added to you. Our ambition is what we are seeking in life. And it's not that the ambition of the pagan life is replaced by no ambition in the Christian life, but rather by a very different ambition, seeking the reign of God. As we pray for God's reign, your kingdom come, so the disciple of Jesus lives for God's reign, seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness. And so I ask you again, are you ambitious? I suspect that most of us have seen enough of ugly ambition to make us a bit shy to acknowledge our ambitions. You are ambitious, but you do your best to hide the fact. And I'm asking you to think about your ambition. What is it? Really? Can you see how your ambition has a lot to do with who you are? Decisions you make. What gets your attention? Your effort. What gets you up in the morning? And as you reflect on your ambition, how do you respond to the ambitions of others? Do they cause resentment? Now, those are tantalising and searching questions. They need time to explore. which is not quite what we're going to do this morning. Let me explain why I'm raising these issues. It's because we're returning, surprise, surprise, to the letter, the first one that Paul wrote to Timothy. And this morning we come to the beginning of chapter 3. And you will notice, as I read this passage in just a moment, that the first sentence of 1 Timothy chapter 3 touches on what I think we can fairly describe as an ambition. Let me read the first few verses of the chapter from the ESV. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Now, friends, at one level, the relevance of this word to many of us here this morning is pretty obvious. Many of us are at Moore College precisely because we hope in due course to be given responsibility to care for, in some way, to some extent, God's people somewhere. And it's important for us to hear what the apostle says about this desire and the qualities that are needed for this work. And I hope that next week we'll particularly give our attention to what Paul says in verses 2 through to 7. This morning, however, I want to focus on verse 1 and see two important perspectives that the apostle's words bring to the ambition, I think that's the right word, that many of us have here. However, we should recognise that in the first instance these words weren't written to a theological college. They weren't in the first instance written to people training for various kinds of ministry, but to Timothy, Paul's trusted colleague, whom he'd left in Ephesus with a particular and difficult assignment to silence certain persons who were teaching something other than the gospel with which Paul had been entrusted. And the letter was written to Timothy with a view to all the ordinary believers in Ephesus who were also expected to hear the letter. And the question arises, why then did Paul raise this subject in this letter at this point? Why was it important here to speak about this ambition? The question is even more puzzling than it might at first appear, for Paul gives a lot of weight to this subject, a lot of weight to the opening sentence of chapter 3 by that curious phrase, the saying is trustworthy. This is the second time he's used this expression in the letter, and it won't be the last. But you remember how important it was last time he used it. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. That was a trustworthy saying. Now, we can't be sure why Paul uses this little phrase, the saying is trustworthy, over and over again in this letter and in a couple of other places. It's possible that he's drawing on some sayings or words, literally words, that had been coined among believers in those days, and he's giving them his endorsement. It's also possible that the teachers that he wanted silenced had sayings and little phrases with which they conveyed their erroneous ideas. And Paul coins his own phrase and says, I'll give you some sayings you can trust. We don't really know. But whatever the particular background of this expression, it does draw our attention to the following words in chapter 3, verse 1 in a rather surprising way. Here is a word you can trust. And it's about an ambition, a desire. Another translation puts it like this: whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now we'll think about the details in just a moment, but for some reason this saying focuses on those Christian people who have a particular ambition. Such Christian people are, I'm sure, rather overrepresented here this morning. But they were there in Ephesus, and they are to be found in almost every gathering of Christian believers. The word he uses for the ambition is quite a strong one. He uses it later in the letter negatively for the craving for money that can draw people away from the faith. Well, here's a very different craving for what he calls overseeing. Now, on the one hand, Paul's words must be important for anyone who has this ambition. For such a person, there in Ephesus, or here this morning, the apostle says, listen up. There are some things I want you to understand about your ambition. Paul's words must also be important for all believers when they see any believer who has this ambition. How are you to respond to this ambition when you see it in someone else? And why? It is an ambition Paul wants to be properly understood and properly appreciated. Now, the two perspectives that I hope we might grasp this morning come from how Paul describes this ambition and what he then says about it. Look at how he describes the ambition. The translations struggle a little bit here. We've heard the ESV, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer. And the slightly different TNIV, whoever aspires to be an overseer. It's a bit better than some of the older translations that are certainly very misleading. The authorised version was, if a man desire the office of a bishop. The NRSV, I'm surprised to see, has unfortunately retained that wording. And perhaps I can have a word to anyone here who does desire the office of a bishop. You will remember that I've just been to General Synod. Or if you aspire to high office in your denomination. And of course we laugh. We laugh because we think what a ridiculous thing it would be. But I tell you, it's there in the hearts of some of us. And I wouldn't mind having a pastoral word with you if that is your desire, but it's not the word of 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 1. The word office that is there in our modern translations has been brought into these translations to try and make sense of what is really an abstract noun, oversight. But the English word office suggests more formal structures than I suspect were present in Ephesus at this time. Literally, the word could be translated simply, if anyone desires oversight. If anyone has a longing for overseeing. That's the ambition Paul wants to speak about. Now, I think it's always interesting when we find that the Bible has a word that we rarely use anymore. It's always worth thinking carefully about whether the different words we use reflect a different way of thinking that needs some rethinking. And we need to listen again to God's words. Oversight. It's an interesting word, episkope. You'll be aware that it becomes a word for a person with certain responsibilities in the Christian fellowship. Episkopos. In verse 2 and following, Paul will be talking about an overseer. And yes, historically, this word becomes bishop. But it would be a very big mistake to read to read today's meaning of bishop, or even the 2nd century meaning of bishop or episkopos, back into Paul's letter. The formal offices that emerged historically are not what Paul had in mind for the believers in Ephesus. What did he mean? What did he mean by oversight? We'd need to look, of course, more widely than the word he chose to use, but it's a good starting point. You see, I'm struck by the fact that Paul didn't say, if anyone wants to be a leader. Leadership wasn't his word. He certainly didn't say, if anyone wants to be an entrepreneur. That's not the ambition he's interested in, here at least. He didn't even say, if anyone wants to be a preacher or a teacher. He says, if anyone desires overseeing. The word has the sense of giving attention to, of caring for, of protecting, of watching over, of guarding. Now, you might notice that this is rather different from a person who you might encounter in some theoretical context who wants to be a bishop. The ambition Paul wants us to think about here is the desire to care for, to protect, to guard, to watch over God's people. Now, he is not suggesting that every Christian should have this ambition or desire, but it is an aspiration to which he is drawing attention. In the Ephesian context, there were certain persons who quite clearly desired to have an influence. We heard about them back in chapter 1, verse 3. They wanted to be teachers of a particular kind. But Paul tells us in that context that they had swerved from that love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. These characters may well have had what we might call leadership ambitions. They might have had leadership abilities, but they were not longing for what Paul here calls oversight. Now, we've not got here in this verse, or indeed in the passage that follows, a comprehensive treatment of all the things that Christian people might desire to do or to be. But it seems to me that the desire Paul draws to our attention here, and the way in which he describes it, does put some of our ambitions into perspective. For you see, here is an ambition that is not about me. And that's why those older translations, and the newer ones too really, are pretty seriously misleading. If I aspire to the office of a bishop, that's about me and what I want to be, even if I aspire to the office of an overseer. But if I long to care for God's people, to watch over, to protect, it's not about me, it's about the people of God. Now, brothers and sisters, our motives for most of the things that we do are muddled. But as I hear the way in which Paul describes this desire here, it's worth taking a careful look at our ministry aspirations. Do you want to be a great preacher? Is there a problem with that? Do you want to be a successful church planter? Is there a problem with that? Do you want to be a leader? Now hear me carefully. I personally hope and I pray that from this body of people here this morning, there will be many outstanding preachers and a good number of effective church planters and plenty of fine leaders. But the problem with these things being your ambition is that all too easily it's all about you. Do you see? Paul is drawing attention to a different kind of ambition. Again, not suggesting that this is what all believers should be aiming for, but its distinctive quality is that it is about the people you care about. If anyone longs to care for, to protect, to guard, to watch over, their aspirations are not filled with themselves, but with those they are concerned for. You know, in our way of organising church and ministry, let me assure you that the difference between a person whose aspirations are all about themselves and the person who longs to care for are very clear to those who either have to endure or benefit from your ministry. Indeed, be careful of thinking like that. Your ministry, my ministry. That sounds like something that I need. It happens too often, I'm afraid, that a person comes to a ministry position in a church full of ideas about what they want to happen, but less full of care for the people to whom they have come. Now, I'm reflecting here on the way in which Paul describes the ambition he speaks of in 1 Timothy 3 verse 1. If anyone desires overseeing, and how it contrasts with some of the desires we ministry-minded people might have. But there's another problem, isn't there? I wonder if you felt it already. Problem with anyone who desires to watch over, particularly if they presume to want to watch over me. You see, Paul is not assuming that all who hear these words will be people who have the ambition he's describing, but if they are Christian believers, they will almost certainly know other Christians who have this desire. But it's a problem. How do you react to another person who wants to oversee your life? What kind of arrogance leads a Christian person to think that they should oversee the lives of others, especially mine? The desire is one that is very easily resented by those who would be overseen. And I take it that that is why Paul says what he says about this ambition. If anyone longs for overseeing, he says, he desires a noble task. A bit more literally, a good work. If you're tempted to resent those, perhaps older Christian people who want to care for you, who want to watch over you, who want to protect you, you need to hear that what they want to do is a good thing, a fine thing. It's appropriate, it's fitting, it's excellent. That's not true of every would-be leader, of course, or even teacher. There were some of those in Ephesus who'd made a shipwreck of their faith and no doubt threatened the faith of others by their ambitions. We heard about two of them by name at the end of chapter 1. And it's partly because there will always be those who undermine true faith, who damage consciences, who disrupt love, that we need those who are willing to oversee. Now that, of course, raises the question as to who should have such a responsibility and how should it be done? We'll come to those questions in subsequent weeks, but for the moment I want to hear the emphasis of this trustworthy saying that this ambition is a good one and it is not to be resented. And one final point. What is good is the work, the task, not the status, not the reputation, not the power, not even the success, the work. And this again is very valuable for ministry-minded people with our muddled motives. Very good for us to hear. The goodness of caring for God's people is the work, not the status, not the reputation, not the success, not the satisfaction, the work. As the years pass, dear brothers and sisters, it will be good to remember this. If you have set your heart on something else, and especially if it's all about you, it is almost certain that you will be disappointed, disillusioned, disheartened. The Christian community is not the place to find an easy platform for our ego to perform. But the work of caring for God's people, though it may bring few egotistical rewards, it's a good work. Yes, it's a noble task. Come back to the ambitions that shape us. Whether or not the ambition Paul describes here is your ambition, try to allow this ambition that he has described and commented on to put your ambitions into perspective. This saying can be trusted. If anyone longs for overseeing, he desires a good work.